There is one clear winner in all of this, isn't there? Keir Starmer.
Well, that's the outcome, but I think more than anything, what we're witnessing in Scotland is the implosion of the SNP. I think that's the dynamic, and it would have been a surprise if anyone other than Labour had actually won the election. So I think that's the interesting thing. I mean, at the level of politics, my big concern is that I can't see any difference between the Labour Party and the SNP other than the question of independence on any of the major issues. I hardly saw politics in this discussion, and that's the thing that's really peculiar at the minute. I'm doing a lot of work in education, and where I see a lot of discussion about values is in schools where teachers are teaching social justice values to pupils, and that's where you get the politics. You get identity politics in school, and then you come to an election like this, and I don't see any politics. And certainly no difference between the politics of Labour and the SNP, unfortunately.
So what you're saying, Stuart, is that Labour are just as woke as the SNP?
Yeah, essentially. And if you look at all the votes over the last 15 years and their attitudes towards education, their attitudes towards the trans question, the adoption of critical race theory in schools, environmentalism in the curriculum, it's almost like they're bypassing adults and having a discussion about values, or rather enforcing a discussion of values onto children.
Iain, great to have you on the show. What does last night's result mean for the future of the SNP and independence?
It's highly significant. I mean, for once, Keir Starmer was absolutely right when he said that they've blown the doors off. They have blown the doors off the SNP in Scotland. This is the beginning of the end of the SNP's decade-long hegemony in Scotland. And it's not just because this is one result, a stunning result that it is, but also because it confirms a general run of opinion polls which indicated there's been a massive switch across to Labour in Scotland, away from the SNP. And this is only going to build up in the next 12 months before the next general election. Because people are going to have the choice now in Scotland. They're going to say, do you want to vote for the SNP, as you have done in the past 10 years, and achieve mediocrity, as is evidently been the case? Or do you want to make a big change? You can change the government in Westminster. That's the deal that Labour is going to be offering them, and it's a very persuasive one. You've got to remember that before 2015, Scotland had always been a Labour-dominated country. In 2010, the general election in 2010, Labour returned 41 seats in Scotland. The SNP returned 6. Now, in this showing, on Rutherglen's showing, they'll get back nearly all those 40 seats. And as everyone says, the road to number 10 for Labour goes through Scotland, and it looks like this is going to deliver a working majority for Keir Starmer.
Well, yes, and of course, Iain, if Labour do well in Scotland, it takes the pressure off them to win back the red wall, which could be tight.
Exactly. And I think, though I understand Stuart's dismay about the drift of intellectual policy and attitudes in academia in particular and in politics, but I think he's missing something very important in Scotland that this by-election results has underlined. There's been a significant sea change in attitudes in Scotland. If you look at Labour's policies in recent months, they've been tacking quite significantly to the right. In 2019, the SNP was significantly, Labour rather, was significant to the left of the SNP when Jeremy Corbyn was in charge. Now they are significantly to the right. In all the key issues that Stuart had mentioned there, gender, for example, a year ago, the Labour Party leader in Scotland, Anas Sarwar, whipped his MPs to vote for the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill. It's hugely divisive and highly contentious piece of legislation which would allow 16-year-olds to change their sex merely by making a declaration. He's now opposed to that. Labour is now opposed to that. Labour now says men are men, women are women, and you can't change sex, just exactly as Rishi Sunak. If you look at welfare, Labour now accepts the Conservatives' two-child cap on child benefits, which Labour used to call the rape clause. Big significant change there as well. Labour also, of course, now accepts Brexit, and of course is totally opposed to any independence referendum in Scotland. And even if you take energy, the rhetoric from Labour has changed very significantly on that as well, on net zero. You know, the SNP says, well, like the Greens, we've got to keep Scotland's oil and gas in the ground. We don't want any of it to come out. We don't want Rosebank. We don't want Cambo. Now Labour is accepting that the Rosebank, highly controversial oil and gas field, should be developed. And he's also saying that fossil fuels will be around for decades to come. So there's a whole range of issues in which Labour has moved very significantly, if you like, to the right. And in fact, I mean, in many respects, it's now occupying not just SNP territory, but Conservative territory in Scotland. Conservatives are nowhere. They came nowhere in Rutherglen. They lost a deposit. But Labour is now taking over their positions, most notably on tax, because this has been the defining issue for Humza Yousaf since he took over the SNP in Scotland. He says he wants to increase taxes even more on people earning more than £50,000 a year. Labour has now said, no, we're not having that anymore. We don't want any more tax. We're not getting any value from it. And Labour now has a presumption against tax increases in Scotland. That's a huge change.
Huge.
So, I mean, you know, you're seeing a very significant development here ideologically and constitutionally as well.
It's fascinating.
What Rutherglen tells you is that independence and an independence referendum for Scotland is off the agenda.
Off the agenda. Fascinating stuff. Stuart, last but not least to you, Labour now have a very good leader in Anas Sarwar, a very articulate guy, popular figure in Scottish politics. Do you think the SNP are ruining the day they elected Humza Yousaf? And do you agree that independence is now gone for a generation?
I think there's a problem with independence, especially when Scotland appears quite static, especially economically. And I think the SNP, working in cahoots with the Greens, have looked a little bit otherworldly in terms of how do we get out of the problems that we have. Humza Yousaf is not a popular politician. I think the idea that the SNP are competent, which is a kind of key thing, and having a statesman-like leader with Nicola Sturgeon, whatever you think of her, she was very, very competent. And so that dynamic, that sense of a statesman-like leader has had a huge blow. And of course, so I still think the dynamic is more to do with the collapse of the SNP. And to some extent, I think the independence question has been undermined by the SNP's, what's happened to the SNP over the last 6 months. Whether Labour are really shifting to the right, if you want to call it that, I don't know what right and left means anymore. I don't know. I suspect perhaps opportunistically, but I suppose that's not a bad thing because they should be trying to reflect the electorate rather than force their values on the electorate. But I'm not going to hold my breath on that one, but we'll wait and see.